My ex-mother-in-law demands to live with me after ruining my marriage. She got housing with padded walls instead. I was having coffee on a Saturday morning when I heard pounding on my door. There stood my ex-mother-in-law, Dolores, with 3 suitcases and a list of demands. She announced she was moving in because she'd retired and needed someone to take care of her. I reminded her that her son and I had been divorced for 4 years, and she said that didn't matter because I'd made vows in church to honor the family, and God doesn't recognize divorce. She pushed past me into my house and started critiquing everything just like when I was married. She said my curtains were cheap, my furniture was tasteless, and the house smelled like failure. She actually walked to the guest room and started unpacking while telling me her daily routine I'd need to follow. She wanted breakfast at exactly 7 with her coffee made with 3 sugars and cream heated to precisely the right temperature. She needed her pills sorted into her weekly container every Sunday. She required drives to her appointments, her friends' houses, and church 3 times a week. She said I owed her this for wasting 6 years of her son's life when he could have found a better wife who would have given her grandchildren. Dolores had spent my entire marriage telling her son I was inadequate. She'd criticize my cooking while eating at my table. She'd reorganize my kitchen when I was at work. She'd tell my ex I was probably cheating because I worked with men. She'd buy him clothes and tell him he needed to look good for when he found his next wife. She actually brought women to our house for dinner without telling me, introducing them to my husband as better options. She'd call me barren when we didn't have kids after a year, not knowing her son had refused to try. She convinced him to hide money from me because wives couldn't be trusted with finances. She'd come over when I wasn't home and throw away my belongings, saying they were cluttering her son's space. The final straw was when she called my boss pretending to be me and quit my job because she said her son needed a traditional wife. That's when I filed for divorce and her son chose his mother over our marriage. Now here she was, 4 years later, demanding I serve her because she'd blown through her retirement savings on cruises and shopping. Her son had cut her off after she did the same thing to his second wife, who also divorced him. She couldn't afford assisted living, and her daughter lived in another country specifically to avoid her. She'd decided I was her only option because I was weak, and she'd trained me to obey during my marriage. She handed me a schedule of her medications, doctor appointments, and social commitments I'd need to drive her to. She told me to clear out the guest room properly because she needed space for her things. She actually started ordering me to make her lunch while she sat in my living room, calling her friends to brag about moving in with her ex-daughter-in-law who still knew her place. That's when I started my plan. I told Dolores she was absolutely right and I needed to make things perfect for her. I said I'd prepare everything, but first we needed to visit her son to get some of her things from his garage. She was thrilled that I was being obedient and got in my car immediately. During the drive, she listed more demands, including repainting my house beige because she hated colors and getting rid of my cat because she didn't like animals. She said I'd need to quit my current job too because she needed full-time care. She actually said I should be grateful she was giving my life purpose since I'd failed as a wife. We pulled up to her son's house, but it looked different. New cars in the driveway, kids' toys on the lawn, and a pregnant woman gardening in front. Dolores was confused until her son walked out with a toddler on his shoulders. He'd gotten married again and had the family Dolores always wanted, but never told her because she'd destroyed his first 2 marriages. His new wife had made it clear Dolores would never meet the grandchildren if she interfered. That's why he'd changed his number and never gave her his address. I'd known all this because his new wife had reached out to me and we'd become friends. Dolores started screaming at her son for hiding grandchildren from her. She demanded to move in with them immediately, but his wife came out and said absolutely not. She told Dolores that she'd heard about how she'd destroyed 2 marriages, and she'd never let that happen to her children. The toddler started crying and called Dolores a scary lady. Her son told her to leave and never come back. Dolores turned to me, expecting me to drive her back to my house, but I said no. I told her she could find her own way to wherever, but it wouldn't be my home. I explained that I'd documented every horrible thing she'd done during my marriage, including the fake call to my employer, which was actually illegal. I said if she ever contacted me again, I'd pursue charges. I drove home feeling free for the first time in years. But when I turned onto my street, there were 2 police cars in my driveway, and my neighbors standing on their lawns watching as officers searched my house. Detective Simmons walked up to my car with handcuffs, saying Dolores had filed charges against me for elderly abuse, financial exploitation, and kidnapping. It sounded like I'd lured a vulnerable elderly woman to my home to steal her retirement money. I told the detective I just refused to let her move into my house. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I tried to explain that she showed up without warning and demanded I take care of her. He asked if I'd be willing to come to the station to give a full statement about what happened today. I said yes, and he told me to bring any evidence of my interactions with her. He walked back to the other officers, and I sat in my car trying to breathe normally. My neighbors were still watching from their lawns, and I felt like everyone thought I was guilty of something terrible. I grabbed my phone and called Grace before the police could change their minds about letting me drive myself. She answered on the second ring, and I could barely get the words out about Dolores filing charges against me. Grace said she'd meet me at the police station in 20 minutes and told me not to say anything without her there. I drove to the station with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Grace was already in the parking lot when I arrived, and she hugged me before we walked inside together. On the way to the interview room, I explained everything about Dolores showing up with suitcases, her list of demands, and and how I drove her to see her son's new family. Grace listened without interrupting, and then told me to stay calm and just tell exactly what happened without getting emotional. A uniformed officer led us to a small room with a table and 3 chairs. Detective Simmons came in a few minutes later with a notepad and recording device. He started the recording and asked me to describe what happened from the beginning. I told him about hearing pounding on my door that morning and finding Dolores with 3 suitcases announcing she was moving in. I explained how she pushed past me into my house and started unpacking in the guest room while listing her daily care requirements. The detective took notes, but his face stayed neutral, and I couldn't tell if he believed me or not. I described how Dolores had spent my entire marriage undermining me, and how she'd even called my boss pretending to be me to quit my job. I explained that her behavior destroyed my marriage 4 years ago and her son chose his mother over me. Detective Simmons asked why I agreed to drive Dolores anywhere if I wanted nothing to do with her. I told him I was showing her that her son had moved on with a new family, and she needed to ask him for help instead of demanding I take care of her. He asked if I abandoned an elderly woman without transportation, and I said she could have called her son or gotten a taxi. The door opened and another detective walked in. She introduced herself as Isla and asked about Dolores' claim that I stole $15,000 from her retirement account. My stomach dropped because I'd never had access to any of her money, and the accusation was completely made up. I told them I never took a penny from Dolores and could prove it with my bank records. Isla asked if Dolores gave me any money today, and I said absolutely not. She showed up demanding I support her because she'd blown through her retirement savings on cruises and shopping. I explained that her son cut her off financially after she interfered in his second marriage the same way she ruined mine. Detective Simmons asked if I could prove I hadn't had any financial dealings with Dolores in 4 years. Grace jumped in and suggested I contact my bank right now to get statements showing no deposits or transactions involving Dolores. I pulled out my phone and called my bank's customer service line. The representative said she could email 4 years of account history within 30 minutes. I gave her the email address Detective Simmons provided, and we sat there waiting. The detectives asked more questions about my marriage and divorce while we waited for the bank records. When my phone buzzed with the email notification, I forwarded everything to Detective Simmons. He opened the files on his laptop and scrolled through years of transactions. There wasn't a single deposit or withdrawal connected to Dolores anywhere in my records. The detective stepped out of the room to make some calls, and I sat there trying not to panic. Grace reached over and held my hand. She reminded me that truth has evidence and lies fall apart under investigation. I realized Dolores probably made up the financial exploitation claim because she was angry I refused to take care of her. She'd always been manipulative, but accusing me of stealing from her was a new level of awful. Detective Simmons came back into the room and his expression had changed slightly. He said they'd contacted Dolores' son, who confirmed his mother had been cut off financially for 2 years. Her son also verified that I hadn't had any contact with his family since the divorce was finalized 4 years ago. The detective's tone softened a little as he told me there were clear problems with Dolores' story. Isla asked about the kidnapping allegation, and I explained that I drove Dolores voluntarily in my car to her son's address that she provided. She got in my car willingly and talked the entire drive about all her demands for how I should take care of her. She only got upset when she saw her son's new family and realized he'd kept his children hidden from her. I left her there with her own son at his house, not abandoned on some random street corner. Isla leaned forward in her chair and asked if anyone saw Dolores come into my house or get in my car without being forced. I sat there for a second trying to remember what happened that morning because everything felt like a blur now. Then I realized my neighbor Mauricio had been outside working in his garden when Dolores showed up. He was right there trimming his bushes when she pounded on my door and pushed her way inside with those 3 suitcases. Mauricio had probably heard everything because my windows were open, and Dolores wasn't exactly quiet when she was making demands. I told the detective about Mauricio and gave them his address, which was just 2 houses down from mine. Detective Simmons wrote down all the information and said they would go talk to him as part of the investigation. He explained that witness testimony would be really important in figuring out what actually happened versus what Dolores was claiming. I felt a tiny bit of hope knowing someone else had seen the whole thing and could back up my version of events. The detective stood up and said I was free to go home for now, but I needed to follow some rules. Detective Simmons told me not to contact Dolores or her son while they were investigating. He said if I tried to reach out to either of them, it would look bad and could hurt my case. I agreed, even though I had zero desire to ever speak to Dolores again after what she just put me through. They walked me out of the interview room and Grace was waiting in the lobby looking worried. She jumped up when she saw me and asked if I was okay. I told her I could go home, but my hands were still shaking from the whole experience. Grace said she would drive me because I was too upset to be behind the wheel safely. We got in her car and she drove me back to my house where police had been searching through everything just hours earlier. The whole drive home I felt sick thinking about how Dolores had actually tried to have me arrested, just because I refused to let her move in and take over my life. She had filed false charges claiming I kidnapped her and stole her money when all I did was set a boundary and say no. Grace pulled into my driveway, and I could see some of my neighbors were still outside pretending to water plants or check their mail while really watching my house. I felt embarrassed knowing they had all seen the police cars and officers going through my stuff. Grace came inside with me and said she was staying because I was too shaken up to be alone. I was grateful because the house felt different now after police had been in every room looking for evidence of crimes I didn't commit. We sat on my couch and I started crying because the whole situation was so unfair and overwhelming. My phone rang around 6 that evening, and it was Detective Simmons calling with an update. He said they had just finished interviewing Mauricio, and his statement backed up everything I had told them. Mauricio confirmed he saw Dolores arrive at my house with 3 big suitcases and force her way inside when I opened the door. He heard her yelling through my open windows about how I owed her care, and she was moving in whether I liked it or not. He saw her get in my car willingly about an hour later, and she looked excited, not scared or forced. Detective Simmons said this witness testimony contradicted Dolores' kidnapping claim in a big way, because it showed she came to my house on her own and got in my car without any force. I thanked him for the update and felt some relief that the truth was starting to come out. Grace gave me a hug and said she knew everything would work out because I had done nothing wrong. But I barely slept that night thinking about how Dolores had weaponized the police against me as revenge for rejecting her. She had turned law enforcement into her personal tool for punishing me, and it felt like a whole new level of manipulation. Grace stayed over in my guest room, and we spent hours going through my phone records, old texts, and emails to document everything. I pulled up 4 years' worth of communication records showing I had 0 contact with Dolores since the divorce was finalized. Every single piece of evidence showed I wanted absolutely nothing to do with her, and had maintained that boundary successfully until she showed up uninvited yesterday. We organized everything into folders on my laptop so I would have proof ready if the investigation continued. The next morning, I woke up exhausted and realized I needed professional help, even though I had done nothing wrong. Grace made coffee and told me I should call a lawyer right away before the situation got worse. I looked up legal aid offices in my area and called the first one that opened at 9. The person who answered listened to my quick explanation and said they had someone perfect for my case. She referred me to Carrie Redmond, who handled elder law disputes and false accusation cases specifically. I called Carrie's office and explained what happened with Dolores and the police investigation. Carrie said she could meet with me that same afternoon at 3 and told me to bring any documentation I had. I spent the rest of the morning gathering my divorce papers, bank statements, and the timeline Grace and I had created the night before. At 2:30, Grace drove me to Carrie's office, which was in a small building downtown. Carrie was in her 50s with gray hair and a calm way of talking that made me feel less panicked. I sat down in her office and told her everything starting from my marriage to Dolores' interference to the divorce to yesterday's nightmare. Carrie listened without interrupting and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she said she recognized this immediately as a pattern of manipulative behavior from someone who destroys relationships and then plays victim when people set boundaries. She asked specific questions about my marriage and how Dolores had interfered over the years. I told her about Dolores reorganizing my kitchen, bringing other women to meet my husband, and calling my boss to quit my job. Carrie said that last one was especially important because it showed a pattern of controlling and destructive actions that went way beyond normal family conflict. Carrie pulled out a checklist and started going through what she needed from me to build a strong defense. She requested copies of my divorce decree and any documentation from my marriage about Dolores' interference. She asked for character references from people who knew me and could speak to my honesty. She wanted records of any communication between me and Dolores over the past 4 years, which was easy because there wasn't any. Carrie explained we were building a case that showed Dolores had a history of manipulation and false claims when people set boundaries with her. She said this wasn't just about proving I was innocent of the specific charges. It was about showing who Dolores really was and establishing her pattern of behavior. Carrie told me that people like Dolores often have a trail of destroyed relationships and accusations behind them. If we could find other people she had done this to, it would help my case significantly. I mentioned that my ex-husband had been married a second time, and that wife had also divorced him because of Dolores. Carrie's eyes lit up, and she said that was exactly the kind of pattern we needed to document. I went home and immediately started searching for my ex-husband's second wife on social media. It took me about 20 minutes, but I finally found her profile and sent her a message. I explained who I was and asked if she would be willing to provide a statement about her experience with Dolores. I told her about the false charges and said any information she could share would really help me. I hit send and didn't expect to hear back quickly because it was a strange request from someone she barely knew. But within an hour, she responded saying she would be happy to help because Dolores had tried similar tactics with her when their marriage ended. She said she had been hoping someone would finally hold Dolores accountable for her behavior. She spent the next hour typing out a detailed account of how Dolores had interfered in her marriage. She described Dolores showing up unannounced, criticizing everything, trying to turn her husband against her and making threats when they decided to divorce. She said Dolores had told her she would ruin her reputation and make sure everyone knew what a terrible wife she had been. The second ex-wife sent me everything in a long document with dates and specific examples. I forwarded it all to Carrie right away and called to let her know it was coming. Carrie called me back 30 minutes later after reading through the second ex-wife's statement. She said this was exactly what we needed to establish a clear pattern of behavior. The statement showed Dolores had destroyed multiple relationships and made threats against people who rejected her control. Carrie said she would contact Detective Simmons to share this new evidence as part of his investigation. She explained that showing a pattern would make it much harder for Dolores to claim she was just a confused elderly woman who got abandoned. The evidence would prove she was someone with a long history of manipulation, who made false accusations when she didn't get her way. Carrie called the detective while I was still on the line, and I could hear her professional tone as she explained the new information. Detective Simmons agreed to interview the second ex-wife as part of his investigation into Dolores's claims. He said the more he learned about Dolores, the more concerned he became that her allegations weren't credible. I hung up feeling like maybe the truth was actually going to come out, and I wouldn't end up facing charges for something I didn't do. 3 days after the police had shown up at my house, someone knocked on my door in the middle of the afternoon. I looked through the window and saw a man in business clothes holding a briefcase and a clipboard. I opened the door, and he introduced himself as Dorian Harvey from Adult Protective Services. He said that given Dolores's age and the serious allegations she had made, APS needed to investigate whether she was actually being exploited or abused by me. My stomach dropped because I realized this investigation was expanding beyond just the police. Dorian explained that elder abuse cases automatically triggered an APS review to make sure vulnerable adults were safe. I invited him inside and told him I would provide full access to everything he needed to see. I showed him my bank statements, phone records, and emails proving I had zero contact with Dolores for 4 years. I walked him through the timeline of her showing up uninvited and demanding to move in. Dorian took notes and asked questions, but his tone was neutral and professional. He said he needed to complete his investigation before making any recommendations, but he appreciated my cooperation. I gave him Carrie's contact information and suggested he talk to her about the pattern of behavior we had documented. Dorian said he would reach out to my lawyer and also interview other people who knew both me and Dolores. He left after about an hour, and I felt drained from having to defend myself again to yet another agency. Dorian pulled out a folder and clicked his pen, asking me to walk him through my relationship history with Dolores from the beginning. I started with the day I married her son 6 years ago, and how she immediately began criticizing everything about me. I explained how she'd reorganize my kitchen when I wasn't home, throw away my belongings, and bring other women to our house for dinner with my husband. I told him about her calling my boss to quit my job, which led directly to my divorce filing. Dorian took notes while I talked, his expression neutral but focused. Then I explained that after the divorce was finalized 4 years ago, I'd had zero contact with Dolores until she showed up at my door yesterday morning. I pulled up my phone and showed him my call log going back months with no calls to or from Dolores. I opened my email and scrolled through hundreds of messages with no communication from her. Dorian asked to see my bank statements, and I logged into my account right there, showing him 4 years of transactions with absolutely nothing involving Dolores. He examined the records carefully, checking deposits and withdrawals and finding no evidence of any financial connection between us. After about 20 minutes of reviewing everything, he closed his folder and said he was satisfied that I wasn't exploiting or abusing anyone. His tone shifted slightly, becoming less formal and more conversational as he explained that many elder abuse cases involve long patterns of financial manipulation, but my records showed the complete opposite. Dorian asked where Dolores was currently staying, and I told him honestly that I didn't know since I'd left her at her son's house. His eyebrows raised and he leaned forward, saying that was actually very concerning, because Dolores had filed multiple reports claiming I'd abandoned her without resources or shelter. He pulled out his tablet and showed me the complaint Dolores had submitted to Adult Protective Services, describing how I'd taken her to an unknown location and left her stranded. I felt my stomach drop because it was such a blatant lie when I'd literally driven her to her own son's home. Dorian said that if Dolores was truly abandoned and vulnerable, she should have accessed emergency services, gone to a shelter, or called the police from wherever she was stranded. But according to his system, she hadn't used any social services or emergency resources since filing her complaints. He tapped his pen against his tablet and said he suspected she was actually staying with her son, but lying about being abandoned to make me look bad. I gave him her son's address and phone number, suggesting he contact him directly to find out where his mother was really staying. Dorian made notes and said he'd follow up on that immediately, because if Dolores was lying about her living situation, it undermined her entire claim of being exploited and abandoned. My phone rang 2 hours after Dorian left, and I saw it was Detective Simmons calling. He got straight to the point, saying they'd located Dolores, and she was staying at her son's house in the guest room. She'd been there since I dropped her off yesterday, but had told police I'd kidnapped her and abandoned her on a random street corner. The detective's voice had a different tone now, less suspicious and more annoyed as he explained that this direct lie completely undermined her entire story. He said when elderly people make abuse allegations, investigators take them very seriously and dedicate significant resources to protecting vulnerable adults. But when they discover the person making the allegations has been lying about basic facts, it raises serious questions about everything else they've claimed. I asked if this meant the case against me was falling apart, and he said yes. The evidence was clearly showing that Dolores had fabricated or exaggerated most of her complaints. He still needed to complete his investigation and file his report, but he wanted me to know that things were moving in my favor. I thanked him and hung up feeling like I could breathe properly for the first time since seeing those police cars in my driveway. Carrie called me that afternoon and I updated her on everything Dorian and Detective Simmons had told me. She said this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to completely dismantle Dolores's false allegations. She'd already been working on a formal response to submit to both the police and adult protective services, and now she had even more ammunition to include. Carrie explained she was gathering witness statements from Mauricio and my ex-husband's second wife, financial records proving I had no access to Dolores's money and documentation of Dolores's pattern of making false claims when people refused to help her. She said she was also preparing a cease and desist letter to send directly to Dolores, warning her that filing false police reports is a crime, and any further harassment would result in legal action against her. I asked how much all this was costing, and Carrie said not to worry about that right now. We needed to focus on clearing my name completely. She said once this was resolved, we could explore options for recovering my legal fees from Dolores, since her malicious false reports had caused all this expense. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like I was actually fighting back instead of just defending myself against lies. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, and when I opened it, I saw it was from my ex-husband's second wife. She said Carrie had reached out to her for a witness statement and she wanted to contact me directly to share something important. She wrote that when she divorced my ex 3 years ago, Dolores had also tried to have her arrested for elder abuse. Dolores had filed reports claiming the second wife had stolen jewelry and money from her, and that she'd been physically abusive during arguments. The police investigated and quickly discovered Dolores was lying, because there was no missing jewelry, no missing money, and witnesses confirmed there'd never been any physical altercations. The charges were dropped within 2 weeks, but the second wife said those 2 weeks traumatized her in ways she was still processing. She'd had police show up at her workplace. Her neighbors had watched investigators search her apartment, and she'd spent thousands on a lawyer to defend against completely false accusations. She said she was telling me this because she wanted me to know I wasn't alone, and that Dolores had a documented pattern of making false abuse allegations when people set boundaries with her. She wrote that she was willing to testify about Dolores's behavior if it would help my case, and she'd already sent a detailed statement to Carrie. I wrote back thanking her and saying I was sorry she'd gone through the same nightmare. We agreed to meet for coffee once this was all over because we'd both survived Dolores and understood each other in ways no one else could. A week passed with me checking my phone constantly and jumping every time someone knocked on my door. Grace stayed with me most evenings because I was too anxious to be alone, and Mauricio checked on me every morning when he saw me leave for work. Then Detective Simmons called and said he had good news. He told me that after completing his investigation, reviewing all the evidence and interviewing multiple witnesses, he was officially closing the case with no charges filed against me. The evidence clearly showed that Dolores's allegations were false, and that I'd done nothing wrong. He said he wanted to apologize for the aggressive approach when they first showed up at my house, but explained that when someone reports elderly abuse, kidnapping, and financial exploitation, police have to take it extremely seriously and act quickly. They couldn't have known at that point that Dolores was lying about everything. I told him I understood they were just doing their job, but I was also really angry that Dolores had put me through this whole nightmare. He said I had every right to be angry and that filing false police reports is actually a crime, though in cases involving elderly people, prosecutors often hesitate to file charges because they worry about the optics. I hung up feeling relieved that I wasn't facing charges, but also frustrated that Dolores might not face any consequences for lying. Carrie called the next day and said now that the criminal investigation was closed in my favor, we needed to take proactive steps to protect me from future harassment. She strongly advised getting a restraining order against Dolores to legally prevent her from contacting me or coming near my home again. I asked if that was really necessary since Dolores was staying with her son now, and Carrie said absolutely yes, because people like Dolores don't stop when they lose one battle. She explained that Dolores had already shown she was willing to file false police reports and make serious allegations when she didn't get her way, and a restraining order would create legal consequences if she tried anything else. We scheduled an appointment to file the paperwork, and Carrie said she'd prepare a comprehensive petition including detailed documentation of Dolores's forced entry into my home, her false police reports, and her established pattern of destructive behavior toward people who rejected her. She said the court would likely grant a temporary restraining order immediately, and then we'd have a hearing in a few weeks to make it permanent. I felt good about taking this step because it meant I was actively protecting myself, instead of just reacting to whatever Dolores did next. 2 days after we filed the restraining order petition, Carrie forwarded me an email from a lawyer representing Dolores's son. The email said Dolores was very upset about the restraining order, and it was causing her significant emotional distress. Her son was asking if I would consider dropping the petition because his mother was elderly and confused, and the legal action was making her health problems worse. Carrie had already responded before forwarding it to me, and I smiled when I read her reply. She'd written that Dolores had filed multiple false criminal charges against me, including kidnapping, elderly abuse, and financial exploitation. She'd explained that I had every legal and moral right to protect myself from someone who'd proven they would weaponize the legal system against me. Carrie had suggested that instead of asking me to drop protective measures, perhaps the son should focus on getting his mother proper mental health support and supervision, so she couldn't continue harassing and making false accusations against people. The email was professional but firm, and I was grateful to have a lawyer who understood exactly what we were dealing with and wouldn't let anyone guilt me into dropping my guard. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and I spent that time gathering every piece of evidence we might need. Carrie had prepared a binder with witness statements from Mauricio and the second wife, financial records showing I'd had no contact with Dolores for 4 years, copies of the police reports showing her lies, and a timeline of her pattern of destructive behavior. The morning of the hearing, I put on professional clothes and met Carrie at the courthouse. We walked into the courtroom and I saw Dolores sitting on the other side with a lawyer in an expensive suit. She looked smaller and older than when I'd seen her a few weeks ago, and part of me almost felt sorry for her until I remembered everything she'd put me through. The judge called our case and Carrie stood up to present our evidence. She walked the judge through the entire timeline, starting with Dolores showing up uninvited at my home, her demands to move in, my refusal and the ride to her son's house, and then her immediate retaliation through false police reports. Carrie showed the judge the witness statements, the financial records, and the testimony from the second wife about Dolores's previous false accusations. Dolores's lawyer tried to interrupt several times, but the judge held up his hand and said he wanted to hear all the evidence first. When Carrie finished, Dolores's lawyer stood up and tried to paint his client as a confused elderly woman who'd misunderstood the situation and felt abandoned by her former family. He said Dolores had memory problems and didn't fully understand what she'd done, and that a restraining order would be cruel punishment for someone who was just scared and alone. The judge looked at Dolores and asked her directly if she understood why she was in court today. Dolores nodded and said yes. She was here because I was trying to abandon her, even though she'd raised me like a daughter. The judge's expression changed and he said that according to the evidence, I was her ex-daughter-in-law who'd been divorced from her son for 4 years with no contact. Dolores started crying and said that didn't matter because family was forever, and I'd made vows in church. The judge cut her off and said he'd reviewed all the evidence, including the police reports where she'd claimed I kidnapped and financially exploited her. He asked if those allegations were true, and Dolores hesitated before saying I'd taken her somewhere against her will. The judge held up the police report showing she'd been staying at her son's house the whole time, and asked her to explain that. Dolores's lawyer tried to speak, but the judge said he wanted to hear from Dolores herself. She stammered and said she'd been confused and scared, and the judge said that filing false police reports wasn't confusion. It was a serious crime that could result in criminal charges against her. He looked at the evidence again, and then announced he was granting a permanent restraining order. He told Dolores she had to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my workplace at all times. If she violated the order, she could be arrested and face criminal penalties. Dolores started crying harder and said I was abandoning her and she had nowhere to go. The judge said firmly that I had no legal or moral obligation to provide care or support to someone who'd falsely accused me of serious crimes. I walked out of the courtroom and Dorian caught up with me in the hallway. He asked if we could talk for a minute about next steps. I followed him to a quiet corner where he explained that Adult Protective Services was opening an investigation into Dolores's mental health and living situation. Her pattern of destroyed relationships, false accusations, and manipulative behavior suggested she might need supervised care. He wanted to know if I'd be willing to provide information for their evaluation. I said yes immediately because I wanted someone official to understand what Dolores was really like. Dorian scheduled a meeting at his office for the next afternoon, and I left the courthouse feeling like maybe this nightmare would actually end properly. The next day, I sat across from Dorian in his small office and gave him a detailed history of Dolores's behavior during my marriage. I told him about the kitchen reorganizing, the women she brought to our house, the call to my boss pretending to be me. I explained how she'd convinced her son to hide money from me and throw away my belongings. Dorian took notes and asked specific questions about timing and frequency. He said this helped establish that she had long-term patterns of manipulation, rather than sudden confusion from dementia. Adult Protective Services was concerned she was a danger to herself and others if she continued making false accusations and burning bridges with everyone who tried to help her. He asked for copies of any documentation I had from my marriage, and I promised to send everything. 2 days later, Mauricio stopped by my house with a concerned look on his face. He mentioned he'd noticed my ex-husband's car driving past my house several times over the past week. The car would slow down near my driveway, then speed up and continue down the street. I felt my stomach drop because this was exactly the kind of harassment the restraining order was supposed to prevent. I immediately documented everything Mauricio told me, including the dates and times he'd seen the car. I called Detective Simmons and reported it as potential restraining order violations. The detective said they'd monitor the situation and would warn the son that he couldn't harass me on his mother's behalf. He suggested I install a security camera pointing at the street to capture any future incidents. Grace came over that evening and found me researching security cameras online. She sat down next to me and said we needed to talk about something important. She told me I should start therapy to process the trauma of being falsely accused and having police search my home. I tried to argue that I was fine, but Grace pointed out that I'd been jumpy and anxious for weeks. She'd already researched therapists who specialized in false accusation trauma and sent me 3 names. I agreed to call them the next day because Grace was right that I wasn't sleeping well and kept replaying the moment I saw police cars in my driveway. The first therapist had an opening later that week and I made the appointment. The therapy sessions helped more than I expected. The therapist listened to everything and helped me understand that Dolores' actions were about control and punishment, not actual need. She'd tried to force me into a caretaker role as revenge for divorcing her son and building an independent life. When I refused, she weaponized the legal system to punish me. The therapist kept reminding me that I wasn't responsible for Dolores' well-being, especially after she tried to have me arrested. I started sleeping better and stopped checking my windows every time I heard a car outside. 3 weeks after the restraining order hearing, Carrie called with news about a settlement offer. She said Dolores' lawyer had contacted her about a possible agreement. Dolores wanted the restraining order dropped and was willing to sign a document promising never to contact me again. Carrie's tone made it clear what she thought of this offer before she even finished explaining. She advised strongly against it because written agreements meant nothing to someone who filed false police reports. A piece of paper wouldn't stop Dolores from showing up at my door again, or making more false accusations if she decided I'd wronged her somehow. I told Carrie I refused the settlement offer completely. I wanted the restraining order to remain in place permanently, because Dolores had proven she couldn't be trusted to respect boundaries or tell the truth. A court order was the only thing that might actually protect me from future harassment. Carrie said she'd informed Dolores' lawyer that we weren't interested in any settlement and would be maintaining the full restraining order. She also mentioned that refusing the settlement would likely push Adult Protective Services to move faster on their evaluation, since Dolores was still trying to manipulate the situation. A week later, Dorian contacted me with an update that made everything feel more real. Adult Protective Services had completed their evaluation and determined Dolores needed assisted living with mental health support. Her pattern of destroyed relationships and false accusations indicated she couldn't live independently without harming others. The evaluation showed she had serious issues with boundaries, reality testing, and accepting consequences for her actions. Her son was resistant to the placement and had hired a lawyer to fight it, but Adult Protective Services had legal authority to mandate placement when someone posed a danger. Dorian said the case would go before a judge within the month. I learned through Carrie that my ex-husband tried everything to fight the placement order. He'd hired an expensive lawyer who argued that Dolores was just lonely and misunderstood. But the evidence was overwhelming and included statements from me, his second ex-wife, and multiple people Dolores had alienated through manipulation and false accusations. The judge reviewed everything and concluded that Dolores had no support system left because she'd burned every bridge through her own behavior. The court ordered her into a supervised facility where her actions could be monitored and she'd receive proper mental health treatment. Carrie said the placement would happen within 2 weeks. A month after Dolores first showed up at my door with 3 suitcases, she was placed in an assisted living facility with psychiatric support. Her son paid for it, but Carrie told me he'd already limited his visits after Dolores tried to manipulate facility staff into believing he was abusing her. The facility was experienced with difficult residents and had protocols to handle false accusations. They documented everything and had trained staff who recognized manipulation tactics. I felt relieved knowing Dolores was somewhere she couldn't hurt anyone else or destroy more relationships. Detective Simmons called me on a Tuesday afternoon to say he was officially closing the case. He'd prepared documentation showing that no charges were ever filed, and all of Dolores' allegations had been proven false. He sent me copies of everything, including the investigation reports and witness statements. Carrie advised me to keep these records permanently in a safe place in case Dolores tried anything in the future. I filed everything carefully in a fireproof box and felt like I could finally breathe without waiting for the next disaster. The week after Detective Simmons closed the case officially, Grace showed up at my door with balloons and a bottle of wine. She'd invited Mauricio and 3 other friends who'd supported me through the whole investigation. We sat around my living room eating takeout pizza while they took turns telling me how proud they were that I'd stood up to Dolores and protected myself. Mauricio raised his glass and said he'd never forget watching me handle everything with such strength when most people would have crumbled. Grace hugged me and whispered that she'd been terrified Dolores would actually succeed in destroying my life, but I'd proven I was stronger than anyone trying to hurt me. The celebration felt simple, but meaningful, because these were the people who'd believed me when Dolores tried to paint me as a criminal. They'd given statements to police, offered to testify if needed, and checked on me constantly during the worst weeks. I looked around my living room at their faces and realized I'd built a real support system of people who actually cared about me, something I never had during my marriage when Dolores isolated me from everyone. We ate cake and laughed about stupid things that had nothing to do with police investigations or restraining orders. For the first time in over a month, I felt normal again instead of like someone fighting for their reputation and freedom. 2 days later, an envelope arrived with my ex-husband's return address written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from him apologizing for his mother's behavior and thanking me for not pressing charges against her. He wrote that he should have gotten her professional help years ago instead of enabling her manipulation and letting her destroy 2 marriages. He admitted he'd always known she was toxic, but chose to believe she'd change if he just gave her what she wanted. The letter said he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again, but he needed me to know he was sorry for everything his mother put me through. He mentioned he was in therapy now trying to figure out why he'd let her control his life for so long. I read the letter twice, then put it in the fireproof box with all my legal documents from the case. I didn't respond because I had absolutely no desire to reconnect with that family or reopen any part of that chapter of my life. His apology didn't change the 6 years I'd spent being criticized and undermined, or the fact that he'd chosen his mother over me when I'd needed him to stand up for our marriage. I appreciated that he finally acknowledged what Dolores had done, but it was too late to matter for us. The following week, Carrie called me to her office to review my final legal bills. She spread the paperwork across her desk, and I felt sick looking at the total. Defending myself against false accusations had cost me nearly $18,000 in lawyer fees, court costs, and related expenses. I'd done absolutely nothing wrong, but still had to pay thousands just to prove my innocence and protect myself from Dolores's lies. Carrie saw my face and immediately suggested we file a motion to recover legal fees from Dolores. She explained that when someone makes malicious false reports that cause significant financial harm, courts can order them to pay the victim's costs. We spent 2 hours going through every charge and documenting how each expense directly resulted from Dolores's false police reports and harassment. Carrie drafted a detailed motion arguing that Dolores had weaponized the legal system against me, and I shouldn't have to bear the financial burden of her vindictive actions. She filed it with the court that afternoon and said we'd likely get a hearing within 6 weeks. I felt a small bit of hope that maybe I could recover at least some of the money this nightmare had cost me. 8 weeks later, the court issued its decision ordering Dolores to pay $12,000 toward my legal fees. The judge's written order stated that Dolores had clearly filed false reports with malicious intent to harm me and cause financial damage. He wrote that people who abuse the legal system to harass others must face financial consequences for their actions. Carrie called me as soon as the order came through and said this was actually a really good outcome since courts don't always award fees, even when someone is clearly in the wrong. She explained that Dolores's son would probably end up paying it from whatever remained of his mother's savings since she couldn't manage money from the facility. The $12,000 didn't cover everything I'd spent, but it helped significantly and felt like validation that the system recognized how wrong Dolores had been. I deposited the check when it arrived 3 weeks later and used part of it to take Grace out for a nice dinner to thank her for everything she'd done. The rest went into my emergency fund because this whole experience taught me how quickly life can throw expensive problems at you. Over the next few weeks, I started feeling safe in my own home again after spending so long looking over my shoulder and jumping at every noise. The restraining order meant Dolores legally couldn't come near me. The APS placement meant she was supervised and couldn't just show up places. The court's validation that I'd done nothing wrong helped me stop second-guessing every decision I'd made. But I still called a locksmith and had him change all my locks even though Dolores had never had keys to my house. I needed that extra layer of security to feel completely at peace. The locksmith installed new deadbolts on both doors and I tested them multiple times after he left. That night I slept better than I had in months, because I knew my home was truly mine again, and nobody could force their way in demanding things from me. I started leaving my curtains open during the day instead of keeping them closed like I had when I felt watched. I played music loudly while cooking dinner instead of staying quiet and alert. Small things that normal people do without thinking became acts of reclaiming my space and my peace. A month after everything settled, the second ex-wife messaged me asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. We'd been in contact through the investigation, but only about legal stuff and witness statements. Now she wanted to actually talk as people who'd survived the same nightmare. We met at a cafe downtown and spent 2 hours sharing stories about Dolores's behavior during our respective marriages. She told me about times Dolores had tried to turn her husband against her using the exact same tactics she'd used on me. We compared notes on the manipulation, the boundary violations, and the constant criticism designed to make us feel inadequate. She said she'd felt so alone during her marriage, thinking something was wrong with her for not being able to handle one difficult mother-in-law. Hearing that Dolores had done identical things to me made her realize it was never about us being weak or inadequate. It was about Dolores being unable to let her son have healthy relationships with anyone but her. We both felt relief that Dolores was finally in supervised care where she couldn't destroy more relationships or manipulate more people. Before we left, we exchanged phone numbers and agreed to stay in touch as friends who understood what we'd survived and came out stronger. My therapist helped me work through the anger I still felt about losing my marriage to Dolores's constant interference. During one session, she asked me to really think about whether I was angry at my ex-husband or at the situation Dolores created. I realized I wasn't angry at him anymore, just sad that he'd chosen his toxic mother over the chance to build a healthy relationship with me. The therapist pointed out that the marriage ending was actually the best thing that could have happened, because I'd never have been happy with someone who let his mother control everything. She helped me see that I'd spent years trying to fix something that was broken from the start, because my ex-husband wasn't capable of setting boundaries with Dolores. If we'd stayed married, I'd still be dealing with her interference and manipulation, instead of living my own life in peace. That perspective shift helped me let go of the last bits of resentment I'd been carrying. I wasn't mourning the marriage anymore. I was grateful it ended before I wasted more years trying to make it work. 3 months after the whole incident started, I ran into my ex-husband at the grocery store while picking up milk. He looked exhausted with dark circles under his eyes and rumpled clothes. We made awkward eye contact, and he walked over saying he'd been meaning to reach out. He told me his mother was making the facility staff completely miserable with constant complaints and accusations against them. She'd already claimed 3 different staff members were stealing from her and tried to report 2 nurses for abuse. The facility documented everything showing she made it all up, but dealing with her took extra time and resources. He said he'd cut his visits down to once a month because every time he went, she spent the whole time demanding he get her out of there and let her move in with him. I felt genuine sympathy for the facility staff who had to deal with her behavior every day, but I felt absolutely none for him. He'd enabled her manipulation and toxic behavior for decades instead of getting her help or setting boundaries. His exhaustion was the direct result of choices he'd made over and over again to prioritize his mother's demands over everyone else's well-being. I told him I hoped he figured things out, then walked away to finish my shopping. I didn't owe him comfort or support after everything that happened. The next weekend, Grace came over to help me redecorate my guest room and erase every trace of the day Dolores tried to move in with her suitcases and demands. We painted the walls a cheerful yellow that made the whole room feel bright and welcoming, instead of like a space that reminded me of that nightmare. I bought new furniture, including a desk and comfortable chair, because I decided to turn the room into my home office instead of keeping it as a guest space. Grace helped me hang curtains I'd picked out myself without anyone criticizing my choices or telling me what colors were acceptable. We spent the whole day painting, moving furniture, and setting up my new workspace. By evening, the room looked completely different and felt like mine in a way it never had before. Standing in the doorway looking at the yellow walls and my new desk, I felt like I'd taken back that space from the memory of Dolores unpacking her things and listing her demands. The room wasn't about her anymore. It was about me building the life I wanted. A few days later, Carrie called to tell me she was officially closing my case. She said I'd handled everything perfectly by documenting evidence carefully and getting professional help immediately when Dolores made her false accusations. Most people wait too long to get a lawyer when they're falsely accused because they think being innocent is enough protection. But the legal system requires proof and documentation, which is exactly what I'd provided from the very start. She told me to keep all the case files and court documents permanently in case Dolores ever tried anything again in the future, though she doubted that would happen now that Dolores was in supervised care with a history of false reports. I thanked Carrie for believing me and fighting so hard when everything felt overwhelming and scary. She said it was easy to fight for someone who was clearly telling the truth and had done everything right. We ended the call and I added her final invoice to my records, then closed the fireproof box knowing that chapter was completely finished. That weekend, I opened my laptop and typed out everything that happened on a legal advice forum I'd found while researching false accusations. I explained how Dolores showed up demanding to move in, how I refused and drove her to her son's house, and how she immediately filed false police reports claiming elderly abuse and kidnapping. I detailed how I'd documented everything, hired a lawyer right away, and gathered witness statements that proved every claim was a lie. I wrote about the restraining order, the APS investigation, and how Dolores ended up in supervised care where she belonged. I hit post and closed my laptop, not expecting much response. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of comments from people saying they'd been through similar situations with manipulative parents or in-laws who weaponized the system when rejected. One woman said her mother-in-law filed identical charges when she wouldn't let her move in after a divorce. Another person shared that their father made false APS reports against 3 different family members over 5 years before anyone flagged his pattern. Several commenters thanked me for sharing the specific steps I took because they were currently dealing with false accusations and didn't know where to start. Reading their stories made me realize how common this problem was and how many people suffered because manipulative family members knew exactly which buttons to push in the legal system. Now, 4 months passed, and I barely thought about Dolores anymore until Dorian called one Tuesday afternoon. He told me Dolores had filed 3 separate APS reports against different staff members at her facility, claiming they were stealing from her and physically abusing her during medication time. The facility had security cameras in common areas and detailed logs of every interaction, all of which proved Dolores made everything up because a staff member told her she couldn't leave the building unsupervised. A PS investigated each claim thoroughly, reviewed all the footage and documentation, then officially flagged Dolores's file as a serial false reporter. Now, whenever she makes any claim, investigators approach it with extra scrutiny and require extensive evidence before taking action. Dorian said this was rare but necessary because Dolores was actively trying to destroy innocent people's lives and careers with her lies. He thanked me again for providing the detailed history that helped APS recognize her pattern early, which probably saved multiple staff members from months of investigation stress. I hung up the phone and realized I hadn't actually thought about Dolores in weeks before that call. My days were full of work, friends, hobbies, and plans that had nothing to do with her or the nightmare she'd tried to create. The restraining order meant I never had to worry about her showing up at my door again. She was in a supervised facility where professionals handled her manipulation and documented her behavior. My house felt completely mine. My schedule was my own, and I slept through the night without anxiety about what she might do next. I looked around my living room with the colorful curtains she'd hated, and my cat sleeping on the couch she'd demanded I get rid of, and I felt genuinely free. Dolores had no power over my life anymore, no access to my space, no ability to interfere or cause problems. That realization hit me while I was making dinner on a random Wednesday, and I actually smiled because I'd reclaimed everything she'd tried to take from me. The following week, I got a message request on social media from my ex-husband's current wife. She said she wanted to thank me personally for getting Dolores into supervised care because it saved her marriage and protected her children. She explained that Dolores had been calling constantly, showing up at their house and trying to manipulate her son into choosing between his mother and his family, just like she'd done in his previous marriages. But once Dolores was placed in the facility with the restraining order preventing contact, the harassment stopped completely. Her husband was finally able to focus on his wife and kids without his mother's constant interference and guilt trips. She said her children would grow up safe from Dolores's toxicity because I'd stood up and fought back when Dolores tried to destroy me. We messaged back and forth for over an hour, sharing stories about Dolores's manipulation tactics and laughing about how similar our experiences had been. I told her I was genuinely happy that her family was protected and thriving, and I meant it because nobody deserved to go through what I'd experienced during my marriage. 2 weeks later, my boss called me into her office and I thought something was wrong until she smiled and told me I was getting promoted to senior analyst. The position came with a significant raise, better benefits, and the respect I'd worked years to earn. I accepted immediately and celebrated by booking a solo vacation to a beach resort I'd always wanted to visit. I spent 5 days walking on the sand, reading books, and watching the sunset over the ocean without anyone demanding anything from me. On my last evening there, I sat on the beach with my feet in the water as the sky turned orange and pink, and I thought about how far I'd come from that Saturday morning when Dolores pounded on my door with her suitcases. I'd stood up to her manipulation, fought off her false accusations, protected myself through the legal system, and came out stronger on the other side. Dolores had tried one final time to destroy me and failed completely because I refused to be her victim anymore. When I got back from vacation, Grace suggested we start a monthly dinner tradition and invite other women who'd dealt with toxic family members. We hosted the first dinner at my house with 5 women Grace knew from various support groups, and everyone shared their stories over pasta and wine. One woman talked about her narcissistic mother who disowned her 3 times for setting boundaries. Another described her sister who'd stolen her identity and blamed her for the financial damage. We spent hours trading advice, laughing at the absurd things our toxic relatives had done, and supporting each other through the ongoing challenges. At the end of the night, 3 different women pulled me aside to say they were inspired by how I'd handled Dolores's false accusations, because it showed them they could fight back too. We scheduled the next dinner for 4 weeks later, and by the 3rd month we had 9 women regularly attending who'd formed genuine friendships based on shared experiences and mutual support. 6 months after Dolores had shown up at my door, I received an official notice that her restraining order was up for renewal. I didn't hesitate or second-guess myself. I filled out the renewal paperwork immediately, attached all the documentation of her behavior and false reports, and filed it with the court that same afternoon. The clerk told me that given Dolores's documented pattern and the facility reports of continued manipulation attempts, the renewal would likely be granted without even requiring a hearing. 2 weeks later, I got confirmation that the restraining order was extended for another 3 years. The judge had reviewed everything and agreed that Dolores remained a threat to my safety and well-being based on her ongoing behavior at the facility. I'd been thinking a lot about how expensive it was to defend myself against Dolores's false accusations, even though I'd done nothing wrong. The lawyer fees, court costs, and time off work had added up to thousands of dollars that I'd never fully recovered despite the court ordering Dolores to pay part of it. So I researched legal aid organizations and found one that specifically helped people defend against false accusations of abuse. I donated a significant amount of money and set up a monthly contribution because I wanted other people to have access to lawyers like Carrie who believed them and fought hard. Nobody should have to face false accusations alone or give up because they couldn't afford proper legal defense. During my next therapy session, my therapist told me I'd made remarkable progress in reclaiming my sense of safety and setting boundaries that protected my well-being. We talked about how Dolores's final attack had actually made me stronger because I'd proven to myself that I could fight back and win against someone who'd controlled and manipulated me for years. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was someone who recognized manipulation, documented evidence, built a support system, and used the legal system to protect myself. Dolores had tried to destroy me one last time, and instead taught me exactly how powerful I could be when I refused to accept her abuse. A full year after Dolores showed up at my door with her suitcases and demands, I was thriving in ways I never had during my marriage. My house was peaceful and decorated exactly how I wanted without anyone criticizing my choices. My friendships were strong and built on mutual respect instead of obligation. I had zero tolerance for people who tried to manipulate or control me, and I cut them out immediately without guilt or second-guessing. Work was going well, my cat was happy, and I spent my free time doing things I actually enjoyed instead of serving someone else's endless needs. That whole nightmare with Dolores taught me my own strength and showed me I could protect myself against anyone who tried to take my peace away. I heard from a friend who worked at the hospital that my ex-husband started therapy sessions twice a week. His current wife told him he needed to work through everything his mother did to him, or she was taking the kids and leaving. She wasn't going to let him mess up their marriage the way he messed up the first 2. I felt bad for him in a way because Dolores really did damage him, but I was also relieved I wasn't part of that family anymore. He had to figure out his own path to healing, and I had mine. Sometimes I wondered if he regretted choosing his mother over our marriage all those years ago, but it didn't matter now. That chapter was closed, and I was living a completely different life. Mauricio started coming over for coffee every Saturday morning after everything settled down. He told me he respected how I handled the whole situation with strength and dignity instead of falling apart. We talked about our gardens, our jobs, and random neighborhood stuff. He became the kind of neighbor you could actually count on, not just someone who waves from across the street. When my car battery died one morning, he came over with jumper cables before I even finished texting him. When he needed help moving a heavy bookshelf, I was there with tools and muscle. We had this easy friendship that felt comfortable and real. I made an appointment with Carrie to update all my legal documents. I wanted everything crystal clear that Dolores had zero connection to me and should never be contacted about anything in my life. We went through my will, my emergency contacts, my medical directives, and every other document that might matter. Carrie made sure the language was strong enough that no one could misinterpret it. I added specific clauses that excluded Dolores by name from any decisions about my health, finances, or property. I never wanted her to have any claim on my life again, not even if I was unconscious in a hospital bed. Carrie reviewed everything twice to make sure it was completely solid and legally binding. 2 years after that Saturday morning when Dolores showed up with her suitcases, I was sitting on my porch with my coffee watching the sunrise. The neighborhood was quiet except for birds and the occasional car driving past. My cat was curled up next to me purring. I thought about how much had changed since that day, and how I'd proven to myself exactly how strong I could be. I fought back against someone who tried to destroy me, and I won. My peace wasn't something I'd ever negotiate away again. I'd protect it with everything I had because I knew what it cost to get it back. Life was really good now, better than it had been in years, and I was grateful for every quiet morning that belonged completely to me.